Major changes in carrier design. With the refinement of the jet engine, planes were going higher, farther, and faster.
The period since the Second World War has seen a transformation of carriers, the planes they carry, and the weaponry they use. The seeds for this rapid development were sown during the war, with much of the change necessitated by one factor, the jet engine. Just after the war, in fact 8 days after, the first major step took place. Carriers got bigger with the launch of the USS Midway. The new ship displaced 45,000 tons in comparison to her immediate predecessors, the Essex class, at 27,000 tons. 6 Midways, a 1942 design, were to have been built, but only 3 were completed. The increase in tonnage was largely accounted for by the addition of an armored deck. This added weight and slowed the ship, so bigger engines were needed, which required a bit more ship and a bit more armor, which implied still bigger engines, and so on, until a compromise had been reached at 45,000 tons. Capable of 33 knots, the Midway represented another step upward in the power of the individual carrier. She would initially be equipped with 73 Hellcats or Corsairs and 64 Helldivers, planes from the Second World War inventory. But this inventory was going into a state of flux as naval planes reflected the rush of technical advance stemming from the war. Work was going ahead, of course, on replacement planes. Grumman working on the Bearcat to supersede the Hellcat, and so on. The Bearcat had, however, been overtaken by history. A propeller-driven fighter was now a thing of the past. It would take a few years for this change to take place, but the arrival of the jet and the advances which were to improve its efficiency and useful output had opened up possibilities of speed far beyond the physical limits of a propeller. The war had seen orders placed for a number of new designs, and several prototypes were being tested or were nearing completion at the end of the war. Some reflected new aims for carrier planes. Grumman's F-7F Tigercat was an attempt to produce a plane which could perform all carrier roles. A fast and heavily armed twin-engine fighter which could carry bombs or a torpedo. The design had been ordered in 1941, and delivery started in April 1944. Predominantly used by the Marines, these planes were not equipped to be deployed from carriers until after the war, and then only in limited numbers as a night fighter. In some ways, the Tigercat did herald things to come. Planes were going to get bigger and heavier and deploy greater individual firepower. However, a prototype that more clearly reflected the future was another Navy fighter, ordered in 1943 and first flown on January the 26th, 1945. This was McDonnell's Phantom, the FH-1. The Phantom made its first takeoff from the USS Coral Sea in July 1946. As the Navy's first all-jet fighter, this plane's development reflects the rate of advances being made. The Phantom was to have been powered by 6 small jets, but even before construction started, it had been possible to radically simplify the plans to the use of 2 engines. Jet engine improvement was setting new airframe design problems at a very rapid rate. For the Navy, adapting the new jets to shipboard use prompted a number of advances in both. The Phantoms were not deployed as carrier planes. Those delivered were used by the Marines, the first jets to make it into Navy service. They were a fairly conventional airframe, influenced by the laminar flow theory, but still straight-winged. The Phantom was capable of just under 500 miles per hour, which put it in good company in 1945, but it was soon to be left behind as planes pushed nearer to the sound barrier. The FH-1 can be seen as a purely experimental aircraft. It is a measure of the soundness of its design that it actually went into production at all. As a test plane, it broke a lot of new ground and drew attention to some of the problems that would have to be overcome in adopting jets for carrier use. It is part of the great post-war explosion of aviation. Experimentation in these years was to lead to major advances, not only in power plants, but in construction methods, materials, controls, crew safety, and a myriad of other aspects of aircraft. As a result of experience and experimentation, aircraft have become more complex, more powerful, faster, and safer. Tests, from the supersonic X-15 flights down to ramming old Avengers into a sandbag embankment, have all made their contribution. At the core of the post-war advance in aviation has been the continual refinement of the jet engine, increasing its power and response, decreasing its thirst and weight. The 1,600 pounds of thrust of the engine used in the Phantom had been doubled just over a year later by the engines adopted for McDonnell's next Navy jet, the Banshee. Again, a twin-engine design, which was to fly a lot of combat hours in Korea. The speed of development of the jets was matched by advances in overall design. Many aspects of the conventional aircraft shape were incompatible with supersonic speed. Radical new shapes, like Chance Vaught's remarkably modern-looking Cutlass, started to be tested. Types appeared and disappeared rapidly. There was high attrition through accidents and equipment failures, and the Navy was ordering planes in relatively small batches, so they remained in service for only a short time. Over 20 different fighter types were built and tested in the 10 years following the Phantom's introduction in 1947. And 12 types actually went into production, over 1 a year. There were continuing development problems with the engines, and McDonnell's 1951 F-3, the Demon, for example, was underpowered. Even so, the shape of the Demon and its speed of 700 miles per hour show the huge leap forward made in the preceding 6 years. While many of these designs were to have short service lives, some were to remain in use for long careers. Chance Vaught's F-8U Crusader stayed in the front line for 20 years. The experimental stage of jet aircraft design to cope with the sound barrier, which had been manifested in the post-war flurry of prototypes, was brief. Major advances since have been largely confined to the incorporation of electronic systems and refinement of design. Even the shapes of variable sweep wing and VTOL aircraft sit easily in the modern design school. The jet planes shared several trends which made them more and more difficult to operate from carriers. They were getting heavier and faster all the time. More importantly, they were requiring higher takeoff and landing speeds and taking a long time at takeoff to achieve liftoff. The increased speed and weight of the planes also had safety considerations. On a carrier, a plane skidding as far as this would have at least hit the barrier, probably going fast enough to tear on through it into any planes parked forward or to career over the ship's bow. The increasing speed of the planes introduced another problem. How do you get a crewman safely out of a damaged plane in supersonic flight? The answer, of course, is that you shoot him clear of the plane and then release his parachute. Today, this is common knowledge. In the late 1940s, it was a real design problem. There was considerable testing to be done to answer the many questions posed by the problem of crew safety. To see what ejection force the human body could stand. What happens to a face when it gets into a 600-mile-an-hour slipstream? What trajectory will a seat follow when shot into the air? And how do you influence that trajectory? If you can get them both out of the plane without colliding with the tail, then how do you keep the pilot and the seat clear of one another? After all, you don't want the seat to clobber the crewman. He has, at that point, quite clearly got enough on his mind. The ejector seat itself contributes a considerable weight to a plane, showing the compounding effect of post-war developments. One safety problem requires a new design solution for all future types. The answer proves to be quite heavy, so the ground rules for design are changed. In future, all designs will have to accommodate the weight. Another example, supersonic speeds demand changes to wing shapes. This solves the problem of speed ripping the wings off. However, it turns out that it also means higher landing speeds. Existing ground or deck systems have to be altered to accommodate this, and so on. A successful development sets a new problem, or in the case of the jet Speed, a whole series of problems. Jets have forced major changes on carriers, both in their shape and in their systems. The early 50s were to see the acceptance of three major new developments to deal with jets: the angled deck, the return of the catapult, and the adoption of electronic landing aids to replace the batsman in guiding the pilot onto the deck. The first of these was the angled deck. By the late 40s, the momentum of planes in flight deck accidents was causing major problems. 10,000-pound aircraft crashing at 100 miles per hour were too much for crash barriers to handle, and accidents often ended up with smashed planes and exploding fuel and weapons. The angled flight deck allowed a plane which missed the arrestor hook to simply open throttle and go around again. Quite apart from this crucial improvement, the angled runway released a lot of the scarce flight deck space for use during launch and recovery operations. The Midways and 14 Essex-class ships were to be progressively refitted to incorporate an angled deck. Other structural changes strengthened the decks to handle the massive landing impacts of heavier planes. The load capacity of the lifts had to be upgraded, and they had to be widened. Whole new parallel fuel storage and delivery systems and new fire suppression systems were built in. Extra bunkering had to be found for fuel for the high-consumption jets. Another advance was the development of the steam catapult. The use of a catapult is essential to get jet planes into the air off a carrier. In today's terms, an F-14 fully loaded takes about a mile to get off the runway under its own power. On a carrier, the 30-ton plane is catapulted airborne at 170 miles per hour in 300 feet.
Carriers.
The big carriers retained in commission have been progressively refitted several times. Additional changes have been made to the systems used. Not the least of these was the elimination of the batsman, whose dancing and cavorting mimicked the attitude of a landing plane and let a pilot know how he was doing. Given the speed of jets, there wasn't time for a batsman to assess the situation, signal to the pilot, and have him take corrective action. This middleman was replaced by a system of lights that directed the pilot onto the carrier's runway. If the light reflecting off the mirror is lined up with the registration lights, then the pilot knows he's on course. Any deviation, and the magnitude of the deviation, will advise him on what response to make. In theory, the mirrors are set for angle and height to suit the plane and the conditions, and the pilot flies his plane down a string of light, safely and accurately every time. In this case, theory and practice are not too far apart. It is estimated that the angled deck and the optical landing system have halved the accident rate on United States Navy carriers. The 50s and 60s also saw the first experiments in fully automatic landings, with the ship taking over the controls from the pilot to recover the plane. In 1952, construction started on a new class of ship, the Forrestal, incorporating all the advances into a new hull. Once again, there was a jump in the size of the ships, an addition of more than 15,000 tons over the midways to displacement of 60,000 tons. This was primarily because of a requirement to maintain the aircraft's capacity. The same number of bigger planes demanded more space. There had been a lot of wrangling over the new ships. There were many who argued that the big carrier, indeed all conventional forces, had been made obsolete by the bomb. In part, therefore, the increased size of the new generation of carriers put forward by the Navy was directed toward giving carriers nuclear attack capacity. In any case, the demands of the jets for space in storage as well as to land and take off commanded bigger ships. In the end, the Korean War settled any doubts in Congress, and approval for the construction of the new generation of carriers was readily granted. For the first time in a United States carrier, the flight deck was built as an integral member of the hull structure. As a result, it was strengthened throughout. The ship's flight deck for the first time exceeded 1,000 feet in length, and she was 240 feet wide. To achieve her speed of 33 knots, her 8 boilers delivered 260,000 horsepower. Everything about her was big, and she presented new construction challenges. The methods developed to build the Forrestals have been the basis for all U.S. carrier construction since. The class was a quantum leap in carrier design. Centerline lifts disappeared completely and were replaced by 4 deck edge lifts, 1 to port and 3 to starboard. 2 catapults were added to the angled deck, giving the ship 4, and the ability to launch 8 planes a minute. Deck clearance in the hangar was 25 feet, allowing the deployment of much larger aircraft. And having been built with jets in mind, she had enormous additional fuel storage. Though some of the innovation in her design responded to general experience, most of the changes could be attributed to the arrival of the jets. After more than 2 years in construction, the ship was launched on the 11th of December, 1954. There would be another 10 months fitting out before she was commissioned. Gradually, the ship would come to life. Her boilers were lit for the first time, and she began to supply her own power. The dockyard crews, plumbers, telephone technicians, carpenters, engineers, electricians, and so on, slowly thinned out as they finished their tasks. Specialist crews started to come on board and familiarize themselves with the equipment. Other sailors started training on the ship. Final checks of fittings and equipment were carried out, and signing over of the ship began. On the 1st of October 1955, the USS Forrestal was commissioned and began sea trials in Navy hands. Six Forrestal-class ships were planned, and construction went ahead. Although there were considerable modifications during their construction, the first 4 ships delivered were all fairly similar. The last 2 were to be so different that they are considered to be a separate class of ship. Construction of these 6 took over 10 years, by which time another 2 of the advanced Forrestals had been launched. The development of missiles, which some assert has made the delivery of nuclear warheads by aircraft obsolete, has not diminished the importance of the carriers. Where once they might have been seen as mobile homes for the missiles, now their worth is accepted even on conventional grounds alone. The United States Defense Department had accepted a need for continuing carrier strength and committed itself to maintaining 15 attack carriers in commission. This commitment has meant that when it has been needed, the U.S. has been able to deploy enormous concentrated mobile power. This factor has been one of immense significance in global affairs.
Anchored in the Persian Gulf, they were a crucial link in America's campaign against Saddam Hussein. Missile-armed warships delivered destruction long distance. Firepower is next. Then at 10 Eastern, Prime Inc.